Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful once again that we can meet, maybe not in person, but as much as it is possible for people so far away from each other. And we ask for your Holy Spirit to bring us close together. Lord, as we continue our study on Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel, we ask that all who are listening and watching and studying, that they can have a clear understanding, that your Holy Spirit can correct any errors that might arise in my instruction, and that you can lead us all to a complete understanding of truth, that you can bring us together so that we can meet together on a sea of glass. We ask, Lord, that you can bless each person individually in their struggles in all ways, but also in the difficulties that we have of understanding present truth. Give us wisdom and discernment. And we pray for this message and the people who have been leading out and the people in Arkansas as they struggle through all this new light. And we just ask, Lord, that as we look at what is old light, that we will see things that are connected with the things you want to show us. Be with us now, we pray and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're continuing the study on the book of Leviticus, and just kind of an overview is that we've seen that there's this connection between Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel. And this connection, part of it is in the structure that exists. Part of it is in the language that's used. There's also the typology that's being used, the various symbols that are being used. All these things are connecting the Leviticus 26 in such a way that we could call it a proto-Daniel. And this makes sense because Daniel is writing prophecies dealing with and addressing the captivity that they're in and the ultimate release from that captivity. So we've gone through some of this quite quickly, but we could see that there was some chronological information that we needed to look at. Obviously, the vision of chapter 2 was important, and the visions of the next group of visions is actually going to be the wild beasts. But we had some stories in there. We had stories dealing with Daniel and his friends. We had the story of the golden image. There's lots of things we didn't address in there. We didn't really address too much the connection with the 2520 there, but we did in chapter 4. So in chapter 4, we looked at Nebuchadnezzar's dream with the 4-7 times in it, and we could see that the language there connected the 4-7 times of Leviticus 26 to the 4-7 times of Nebuchadnezzar. We also looked and began to look at Daniel chapter 5, and we didn't really finish Daniel chapter 5. Now, the way that I originally structured this presentation when I wrote it back in 2013, the idea was I would build upon this topic. I would start with Leviticus 26, but not explain it in much detail other than that it was a structure that dealt and led to the captivity, and then go through each of the chapters and build up to a point that I could present the 2520 prophetic mirror at the end. Now, since that time, our understanding has grown. We have much more in the prophetic mirror than what we knew before. But back in 2013, we had just discovered this prophetic mirror. And at that time, I was really fleshing out the beginning and the end of it, the 65 years at the beginning and the end that are both divided as 19 and 46 and 46 and 19. But there was, with the 2520 for Judah, which goes from 677 to 1844, I had no division for it. Now we know the division is 220 years and 2300 years. At the period of Leviticus 26, where it's literally fulfilled, in the Babylonian captivity. And the 3 decrees that end those periods are attached to the 2300 days by the 3 decrees, the same 3 decrees that end the periods of 7 times that are in Leviticus 26 also commence in a reform line, they commence the 2300 days. And that those the 3 decrees, Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, end the periods, but they start the 2300 days. So they tie the 220 to the 2300 days to make it 2520. But there is no direct 2520 from Leviticus 26. And so I'm kind of reviewing, but I'm kind of looking ahead. But when we look at these passages, or these chapters, chapter 4 and 5, we know that there are 2 different 2520s that are being talked about. So for Nebuchadnezzar, his 2520 is in Daniel chapter 4. And his 2520 is a period of 7 years. So he's got the 7 years. And of course, this idea, this is not a study that we're doing on this, but if we go back to this idea of these 77 years, we can see that there are other periods where you have 2 2520s connected to each other. Leah and Rachel, plenty and famine, and the story of Joseph. So these types of ideas that 7 years can be tied with another grouping, in this case, not 7 years. So here you're going to have a 2520 for Belshazzar. But his 2520 is it's in Daniel chapter 5. We dealt with it, but it's actually in the Mene Tekel Upharsin. So it ends up being 2520 giras. Which is weights, or you could look at it as money, because they're really the same thing. So these 2520s are represented in different ways. And we could also say that this is represented as a 126, because that's how many shekels. And it also can be 151, which ends up being a different number, 3020 giras. But this 151 and this 126 are related, which we're not going to go into right now. But when we look at this one, we would call this the good 2520. That is Nebuchadnezzar. This represents Judah, and this represents Israel. And we know that Judah repented, and they have a reform line where they repent. But they're scattered, but they are gathered. Literal Israel is. But also they're gathered in our time, in the Millerite movement, which we're going to see as we go through the rest of the book of Daniel. We're going to see that this is representing God's people who, even though they're scattered, they are going to be gathered at the end. And this is representing God's people who are scattered, but never to be gathered. So this is northern Israel, typifies this, but also Belshazzar's personal 2520. He ends up being killed. He doesn't, and even if we look at the end of the 2520 that this symbolizes, that 2520 goes to 1798. The group that is gathered at that time is Protestantism, but Protestantism ends up becoming Babylon in the Millerite time period. So Protestantism is gathered. Of course, it's not. So northern Israel is a type of Protestantism. Obviously, northern Israel has church and state, Dan and Bethel. So a lot of these things, these details, and what I'm trying to say is there's all these details that I could go into as we study these things. But I was trying to do a fairly simple study on the book of Daniel and seeing the connections. So one of the things that we can then recognize, if we look at Leviticus 26, that Leviticus 26 is talking not just about the 2520 for Judah, which began in 677, that William Miller understood, but it's also talking about the 2520 for Israel. It happens in a different way, and it happens in a way that represents its characteristic. So in this 2520 for Judah, so I'm kind of jumping ahead, but this is not in the notes, because when I wrote the notes, I didn't understand this. I mean, I understood Judah and Israel, but I didn't understand the differences in the structures of these periods. So if we just look at the 2520 here for Israel, it has 538 AD in the center of 723 BC and in 1798. And so we have these two 1260s. So it's divided in this way. And this is, of course, a chiasm. And this chiasm represents paganism. And this represents papalism. And paganism is a counterfeit of the earthly sanctuary, and papalism is the counterfeit of the heavenly sanctuary. And of course, this would also be a counterfeit of Christ's covenant week, where he ministers for 1260 days on earth and then 1260 days in heaven. And of course, we know that Leviticus 26 is all about this covenant. And this covenant number, there's a number of things, obviously, but part of the covenant is the sabbatical cycle, both in its weekly aspects and also in the yearly sabbatical cycle and the Jubilee cycle. So in the book of Daniel, we see the sabbatical cycle and the Jubilee cycle referenced, but mostly in an indirect way. So he doesn't really talk about the sabbatical cycle, but we know that it's going to be described, especially when we get to chapter 9, dealing with the 70 years. We'll see how that connects. So here in chapter 4 and 5, you see two different representations. So this would be Belshazzar's 2520, which was based on 126 shekels, but then represents 2520 in that a gira is 20. So the fact that it's broken this way could partly be understood by the fact of the 126 shekels. But it's also could be laid over top of each other. So you can see that paganism and papalism parallel each other. We can break them apart and lay them over top. Now, if we deal with the 2520 for Judah, we know that it goes like this. So let me put this over here. So you got 220 years at the beginning, dealing with 677 BC, and this ends in 457 BC. This is the period of Leviticus 26 that it covers this whole period. And then we have the 2300 days or years that go to 1844. So the difference here is part of it is at the beginning. We know here that Leviticus 26 is fulfilled in a much more, literal isn't quite the right word, but in a much more specific way, that the 4-7 times all end up being periods of 70 years, 100 or 140 years, and then they all end with the 3 decrees in this period. And so Leviticus 26 being fulfilled here, we have these definite dates and this definite structure that's very different than the structure in this one. And that's always kind of puzzled me. I'm not sure if I fully understand why Israel is broken into this way. But I think if we compare this to Belshazzar's vision, and we compare this to, or not vision, but his 2520, and then the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, in Nebuchadnezzar, he's symbolizing this 2520, where he's restored and he's actually worshiping the true God. Here in this one, we have paganism and papalism. The Protestants arise here, but they're going to fail the test that comes between 1798 and 1844. So they're going to fail that. Actually, specifically on April 19th, 1844, Protestantism has now become part of Babylon. And that happened progressively. So now you have God's true church here, Judah, but Israel, and this goes to some of my other studies, like the joining of the two sticks, all these studies kind of fit together. But we can see here that what happens to the United States, in this history, this is going to be the first horn falls, which is Protestantism. And in our history, republicanism is going to fall. So at the beginning of the United States and the end of the United States is where the United States at the end will speak like a dragon, even though it has two horns like a lamb. So it's a lot of information. The thing that I want to point out is that in the book of Daniel, in trying to connect this, we can obviously see we're connecting this to Leviticus 26. When you take Nebuchadnezzar's 25:20 and Belshazzar's 25:20. And to try to show that to people, I don't think it's that difficult. You know, obviously this one here, you can definitely see the counterfeit aspect, which occurs in paganism and papalism with Christ's week. In this one, we see this different structure, and part of this structure is going to be the 70 weeks, which we're going to get into here. So you're going to have 490 years here that's a part of it. And this 490 years is cut off from the larger period. Now this here gives us a whole bunch of symbolism that's then going to be brought down to this history, especially the 70th week. And you can see within this one, you have that, you know, if I was going to bring it up, you have here at the end, you have this that's in the one for Israel. You have the 27 and the 34 with the 31 in the middle. So you do have this in this line, and it's an important part of this line. But it's showing that there's two classes, two groups of people that are going to be represented. So Satan, in his counterfeit, he takes this week, this one little part out of this big structure, which is the 25:20 for Judah, and he creates this counterfeit. And so he's trying to counterfeit the work of Christ. So I know there's more to it than that, but I just want people to sort of think about that. When you think about the two 25:20s, the one for Nebuchadnezzar, the one for Belshazzar, and you then start to apply these to our big 25:20s, that the symbolism that's there is very important. And I don't think we've delved into it as completely as we should have. So we're kind of, what I think ends up happening is we're sort of happy with these structures, and the structures are important, but we don't take the time to really understand what they all mean. Now we're kind of being forced to here as we're moving on through history to look at these things again. But in a sense, in our message, this is kind of a foundational part of our message that often many people can't even draw out. They don't even understand it. They don't understand the symbolism, that happens, and especially when we put it into the whole prophetic mirror, because on each of these we have 46 years at this side and 46 years here. But we also end up having the 19 years, which leads us to 1863. And on this side, the 19 years that leads us to 742, where we have a civil war here and a civil war here between the North and the South. And even though we understand this to some degree, this idea of the 2,604 years, which represents 264, which is a message that we're having right now dealing with Islam, we're not even fully aware of what this all means. So we have this number, we have these dates, but we haven't really delved into the connection between what's happening in future and what's happening now to the past. And as we walk over the ground of fulfilled prophecy, we look it reflects back onto past events, and it's the past events that now are understood that shine light forward into our path. And so that's why we're going through these studies. You need to be able to draw out the 22520s with the prophetic mirror, but you need to also understand this history, which we're going to go into. We've dealt with this a little bit, but not a lot. When we get to Daniel chapter 9, we'll deal with this. But we'll start to see how this all fits together in this big structure, that you can't leave out the 70 weeks when you're dealing with the 2520 here. And there's more to these structures even than what we have here. So that's just to try to finish up Daniel 4 and 5, at least to look at the implications of it. Now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 6 and 7. And so bring up my notes. So we dealt with Belshazzar's party a little bit. There was lots of things in there that I could have touched on that I didn't. Some of this history. So I want to deal with these ideas of these stories. So when we look at the second vision, or the first vision that happens in Daniel chapter 2, we know that that vision is then going to be displayed in chapter 3 with the golden image set up on the plains of Dura. But we also have this story that precedes it, which is the story of Daniel and his friends. So Daniel chapter 2 is bookmarked, or bookended, I guess, by these two different stories that lead to understanding it. So one is we have Babylon introduced. We have to know who Nebuchadnezzar is. When he has that dream, then his reaction creates this prophecy, if you want to look at it. This prophecy is, it's a prophecy well, when we look at the prophecies, when we're trying to understand these stories are prophecies. So Daniel chapter 3 is a prophecy about the Sunday law, but it's done in a story with Nebuchadnezzar, and we know that it's all symbolic about the end of the world. And there are some symbolisms that are there, like the statue, which represents 666, it's 60 by 6. And we have also, the fiery furnace. We could look at that. We could look at the people in there, the 3-1 combination of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So there's lots of different things that we can look at. And we can even look at, the music that's being used, and which represents, of course, the manipulation that exists at the end of the world, false worship, all these types of things. So there's so many things that we can look at in that story. Now, when we get to Daniel chapter 6, we have a story that precedes, it's the story that precedes chapter 7. And chapter 7 is a prophecy with the wild beast. It parallels the second 7 times, the one where Daniel's taken captive. So when I originally wrote this out, I obviously didn't understand that completely. I say the historical prelude in, and I need to shrink this a little bit. There we go. The historical prelude in Daniel 6 that precedes the vision of the wild beasts of chapter 7 is placed there either purposefully or providentially. Again, which are both the sort of the same thing. God puts it either there purposefully, or it just happens by God's providence, which would still be purposeful. Again, we see a test put forward. Daniel is tested to see whether or not he will be faithful to God in regards to public prayer. Daniel is a man of prayer. The fourth test, first was appetite, then the test before the king, then the image. so there's been 3 tests so far, deals with the legal inactions of the Medo-Persians. So this one, this 4th test, deals with the legal inactions of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed or altered. This law stands in opposition to the law of his, Daniel's God. The judgment that is given places him in a den of lions, wild beasts. So we can see he's going to have a vision about wild beasts, but in the story that precedes it, there's going to be wild beasts that are used in other places of Scripture as symbols of judgment of the 7 times captivity. So we're just going to look at a few of these verses. Therefore I will be unto them as a lion, as a leopard by the way I will observe them. And in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation, it says, by the way of the Assyrians. I will meet them as a bear that is bereaved of her whelps, and will rend the call of their heart, and there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them. So this is from Hosea, or Hosea. So this is referring to these, if you look at it here, you have a lion, a leopard, a bear, and then a wild beast. So we're going to see these in Daniel chapter 7. In Jeremiah 4, verse 5-7, it says, declare ye in Judah and publish in Jerusalem, and say, blow ye the trumpet in the land, cry, gather together, and say, assemble yourselves, and let us go into the defense cities. Set up the standard toward Zion, retire, stay not, for I will bring evil from the north, and great destruction. The lion is come from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles, or the nations, is on his way. He is gone forth from his place to make thy land desolate, and thy cities shall be laid waste without inhabitant. So again, we can see wild beasts here representing Babylon that's going to come, which is in the book of Jeremiah. And then we have in Ezekiel, moreover, take thou up a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and say, what is thy mother? A lioness. She lay down among lions. She nourished her whelps among young lions. And she brought up one of her whelps. It became a young lion, and it learned to catch the prey. It devoured men. The nation also heard of him. He was taken in their pit, and they brought him with chains into the land of Egypt. Now when she saw that she had waited, and her hope was lost, then she took another of her whelps, and made him a young lion. And he went up and down among the lions. He became a young lion, and learned to catch the prey, and devoured men. And he knew their desolate palaces, and he laid waste their cities, and the land was desolate, and the fullness thereof. Then the nations set against him on every side from the provinces, and spread their net over him. He was taken in their pit, and they put him in ward in chains, and brought him to the king of Babylon. They brought him into holds, that his voice should no more be heard upon the mountains of Israel. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, because this could be a whole study in and of itself. But we can see that, and of course, Judah is a lion, right? But all these lions are representing kingdoms in some form or other. And obviously, a kingdom being a lion shows its destructive power. And that's one of the things about the beast. When we look at the image or the symbolism that the beasts have, it has to do with this destructive nature of these kingdoms. And so actually, I guess you could read this. This is just from a commentary dealing with this passage. Maybe I should read it. The princes of Israel to whom the lamentation applies are the king, 2 of whom are so clearly pointed out in Ezekiel 19, verse 4 and 19, verse 9, that there's no mistaking Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin. This fact alone is sufficient to protect the plural princes against the arbitrary alteration into the singular prince proposed by some other commentators, based on the Septuagint. The lamentation is not addressed to one particular prince, either Zedekiah or Jehoiachin, but to Israel as a nation. So basically, these people were being taught, and they were being directed by Egypt, which is because Egypt, I know, put Jehoiachin put Jehoiakim on the throne, and he was basically a vassal of Egypt. Zedekiah was put on the throne by Babylon. So we can see that there's these two powers that are using Israel as a pawn. So I'm not going to go into this too much because it's a long reading. It would take a long time. But people can look at that in the notes and see what they think about Keel and Delitzsch in their commentary. It'd be Keel because it's Old Testament, on Ezekiel 19, verse 1 to 9. Now we have another symbol of the lion that originally referred to Judah, became a symbol of the Gentile nations when Israel was being chastised by the Lord. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion. And as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of thy people be. So here in this context, this is showing the strength and power that God's people would have. Judah is, of course, has the kingship, which that's where the kings of Judah all come from, the tribe of Judah. They're descended from Judah. And I made a note here that the judgment of the scattering came upon both northern Israel and Judah, but only southern Israel, which contained the Hebrew sanctuary, into which all Israel was to gather during the feast, will be gathered again. So when it says, unto him shall the gathering of the people be, this is referring to the fact that the temple was in Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and that's where the people were supposed to gather. So when Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the kingdom was divided at that time, Rehoboam listened to the counsel of the young men, and that opened up the door for Jeroboam to come in and take over northern Israel. And then Jeroboam built the two golden calves, one in Dan and one in Bethel. So he didn't want people gathering in Judah, in Jerusalem. And then we have the Gentile nations of Daniel 7. So that's basically Daniel 6 in very much of a nutshell, dealing with that part of it. So obviously I didn't go through the story itself in looking at this. I just looked at the symbolism. So, probably I should go back a little bit and just look at some of this story in the book of Daniel. And so in Daniel chapter 6, there's a bunch of symbolism here, a bunch that goes through the story. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, the king should have no damage. In this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. And then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, and neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Therefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel which is of the children of the captivity of Judah regardeth thee not, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. But he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. A stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, and that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Now, of course, I'm just reading through this, and we're familiar with it, and I could just be commenting as we go all the way through here. But as you look at this story in the context of the Sunday law, you can see that this is all connected. The laws of the Medes of the Persians that cannot be changed. When you look at Daniel chapter 7, we're going to see there that they seek to change times and laws. So here you have the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed. But that final beast is going to seek to change times and laws. So there's this connection between the beasts. There's connections between the laws. There's lots of different connections that we're just skipping over because we could spend a lot more time in studying these chapters. Now, we know, of course, what happens. We know that Daniel, that God shuts the lions' mouths, that they don't hurt him. And then Darius writes in verse 25, Unto all people, nations, languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that every dominion of my kingdom men tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. Right? So we know, again, these kings all do the same thing. They're impressed by Daniel's God, but they're not necessarily godly. They don't become true worshippers of the true God, except Nebuchadnezzar finally did. Now, we also deal with the time in which this story occurs. So now we're going to go to Daniel chapter 7. And so when we get to Daniel chapter 7, we're actually at a story that's earlier, because this is in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So we know the other story in chapter 6. If it was put in the chronological order, this would have been later on, but it's here before chapter 7. Now, is there any thoughts of why Daniel put the chapter in that place? Any thoughts on that?
It kind of divides the book into the stories, and then you have the prophetic visions.
Yes. So we could put it that way. We could say that, stories at the beginning, but we do have Daniel chapter 2, which is a vision. But it wouldn't make sense if you put Daniel chapter 2 later, because it needs to be in the middle of the stories there. And also, it's not a vision of Daniel. It's a vision, it's a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. So I think that's part of it. But there's something about this structure. We could call it chiastic, if you wanted to look at it that way. I mean, it's divided into half. You got 6 chapters, which deal with the stories, and then 7 chapters that deal with the visions of Daniel. Any other ideas on that? Anybody thought about this before? Now, one of the things you'll find is the language that's used in the first part of the book is Aramaic. You'll see this in Daniel chapter 6. I just held my cursor over top of my e-sword. If I hold my cursor over there, it'll tell you that the vocabulary here is all Aramaic or Chaldee, as it says. Now, when we start out in the book of Daniel, it starts out in Hebrew, and then what happens is it changes when you get to chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar starts to tell his story. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are all written in Aramaic. And I believe chapter 3, I thought, was as well.
I think it's chapter 2, verse 4, I think there's something around that there.
Chapter 2, where?
I think it's verse 4. Yes.
4, that's where.
That's where it changes. It
Yeah,
says in Syriac.
Right. So chapter 2. So chapter 1 is in Hebrew, and then it changes in chapter 2, verse 4, when he speaks in Syriac, it says there. And then you'll see from then on, that's why when we looked at chapter 3, and we looked at the 1 7 times hotter than it was wont to be heated, that was in Aramaic. So Syriac, Aramaic, Chaldee, it's just different words for the same language, the language of the Arameans. And so we see that there's this language grouping that happens. Now, obviously, the first part, Daniel chapter 1, is written in Hebrew. So that introductory chapter is written in Hebrew, but as soon as you get these stories, they all of a sudden become Aramaic. So Daniel wrote in Aramaic, and this part of the book. Now, of course, his readers would be familiar with both Aramaic and Hebrew, and they're sister languages. It would be similar to Dutch and German, even Old English and Dutch, or Frisian and Old English, very, very similar. So if you knew one, you would know the other. I remember we had back before the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, we had in our church one time, we had some pastors from Russia show up. The church that I go to, Warburg, it was originally a German church. And the Russians spoke German, but they also spoke Russian. And they were telling us stories, so we ended up having like a whole day. They just showed up for the service. We ended up giving them the sermon, and then we had a spontaneous potluck, and then we had meetings all afternoon. Now, some of the people there, of course, were German, and they did most of the sermon and their talks in German, and it was translated into English. But one of my friends was Ukrainian, and he could talk to them in Ukrainian, and they would understand him, and they could talk back to him in Russian, and he would understand them. So you have some languages that are very, very similar. There's a lot of difference in the orthography and the spelling of these languages and how their letters look. But they're very, very similar vocabulary, very similar, especially grammatically. But anyway, that's kind of an aside, just something that's of interest to me, I guess. But we have this change in language that occurs, but also the change of the story part of it to the prophecies or the visions of Daniel. So when we get to Daniel chapter 7, we're now back into Hebrew where we started in chapter 1. And the point of which we are in Daniel 7 is in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now, I've seen a lot of different ideas about when the first year of Belshazzar is. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He never becomes the ruling king, the first in command. He's always the second in charge. And that would have happened probably, we're not 100% certain, but it was within a short time after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. He did not co-rule with evil Merodach, but he co-ruled with the next king. So you're looking at probably 560 BC that Nebuchadnezzar begins to share a part in the throne. Whether he's a co-ruler at that time, the second in command, or whether he's just a prince, we're not certain. But definitely, most of the people that I've seen talk about this, they try to put the first year of Belshazzar like 3 years before he's killed, which is wrong. So this is not later on. This is still early in the time of, somewhere in the middle of the 70 years. Obviously, if you had 560 or 559, and you go back to 607, that would put us like 47 years. So you'd have, I think, if I remember correctly, it's about 19 years from when Belshazzar is made king to when he's killed, if I remember, or to when Cyrus comes to the throne. So of Babylon. So I'm not 100% certain on this. Like, I have ideas about it, and we've tried to look at it. But the point is, this is not near the end of Babylon. This is near the beginning. Now, we'll find when we get to chapter 8, it's going to be the third year, so it's going to be 2 years later. Again, people will think that this is really late in Belshazzar's reign, shortly before the fall of Babylon. But again, it's not. So chapter 5 is in 539. This would be, a lot earlier. So back at chapter 7, and I'm going to get rid of my Hebrew numbers here, so it makes it easier to read. And we're all familiar with this, so I'm still going to read it, though, and then try to comment as we go along. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and the visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. And the four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So this would refer to Babylon and to Nebuchadnezzar's conversion, this new heart being given him. And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. So it's Medo-Persia. 2 phases of it, Media and then Persia. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. And the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given unto it. So obviously this is suitable for Greece, because it's, they're going to tell us that, obviously, as we go through it. And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth, and it devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So obviously, Seventh-day Adventists should be familiar with these visions, and a lot of the symbolism that's in it. And we can see clearly as we go through this, obviously it's talking about Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, which is the subject of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now it says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. I held then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So there's, again, lots of material in here that we could look at. So we know that when we go to the second 7 times, that's the one where the wild beasts shall rob you of your children. And so we're already comparing this, Daniel 7, the second vision or second dream, that we can compare that with the second 7 times. And we did the same with the first 7 times. The first 7 times is the pride of your power. So Nebuchadnezzar experienced the symbolism of what was going to happen to Judah in 677. I will break the pride of your power. And that was a fulfillment of Isaiah 7, which there was 65 years given. And so the pride of power was broken in 677. A prophecy of 65 years was given in 742 BC. So to try to address this at least a little bit, just so people are clear, we obviously have 742 BC, the 65-year prophecy, and then we have 677. Now, when we're dealing with this, we can see that this would be for Judah. But this prophecy here is actually dealing with 723. And I want this to sort of be clear, that when we're dealing with the Judah prophecy, which Nebuchadnezzar has, we can see also, what's that?
Switch the screen.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so to try to illustrate this, we know the 65 years divided into 19 and 46 years. And the pride of the power, we know that Nebuchadnezzar is symbolizing this in his 2520. And we know that Belshazzar is symbolizing this. But when you deal with the vision of the 7 beasts, it's going to symbolize overall this division of pagan and papal. And we're going to see this also in Daniel chapter 8. So these nations, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, these are pagan nations. But this little horn power, which is Rome, is going to have a pagan and a papal phase. And so this 4th beast is the one that we really need to understand. Of course, we can't understand it without understanding the beginning. So let's go on and read a bit more. We'll come back to that. So we're going to start to get into the interpretation of this as we go through, and we'll look at what kind of things are added in the interpretation to this dream. So we know the judgment begins. The judgment is set and the books were open, and so we know that's the time of the judgment, 1844, and that this is going to carry all the way until the beast was slain, and then it goes back, the rest of the beasts. So there's the final beast, but all the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, so they don't continue. Yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I don't think that means that after they're destroyed. It could mean that way. I'm not sure. It could refer to a period of time in which, we have the United Nations. I'm not certain, but I would think it's just referring back to they all existed for a season and a time. But somebody might have a different interpretation of that. In verse 13, then I saw the night visions, behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancients of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. So we obviously know this is the second coming of Christ. It's very obvious. all the symbolism there and the language. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by and asked him the truth of all this. And so he told me, and made me know the interpretation of the things. So obviously he's going to be given the interpretation. And it's this: these great beasts, which are four kings or kingdoms, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. So this is a really brief description. If you're going to describe that vision, this is probably about as brief as you could describe it. There's these kingdoms, these four great beasts, they're the kingdoms, but they're going to end, and God's people will take the kingdom. So they will have this new kingdom. And this we saw in chapter 2 with this stone being taken out of this mountain and then striking the feet of the image, and then that stone growing into a great mountain or kingdom that's going to consume the whole earth. So we can see that the story is the same. And obviously, if you saw this in an evangelistic series, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, you would have a much more detailed presentation than you would if you saw this presented now. Adventists used to have better understanding of these prophecies than we do now. Evangelistic series make very cursory references to prophecy now, where there used to be evangelistic series was a prophecy seminar. You went through the prophecies in the book of Daniel and Revelation. So there's a lot of details here that we may at one time have understood, but that are often now sort of missed out. So they would have spent a bit more time looking at, and especially when we get into some of this later interpretation of what it means, because he's going to explain later. So this is kind of like a nutshell of it, and then he starts to go to the fourth beast. So he's not as concerned about Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. He's concerned about this fourth beast. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. Now, one of the aspects of this fourth beast, which is obviously it starts with Rome, and pagan Rome and papal Rome, so they're sort of tied together here in this fourth beast. So it's not just the papacy, but they have the same characteristics. And we know that the papacy, when it moved from pagan to papal, retained many of the characteristics of paganism, but now it had clothed them in, instead of animal sacrifices, there's the sacrifice of the Mass, but it retained basically the same principles that paganism was based upon, which one of them is the appeasement of a god. But this characteristic also of the stamping down, this is an important part of it. And this would be more to do with the papacy than Rome, though Rome had this characteristic. Rome is a destroyer. My wife and I watched a documentary about Hannibal. It was in the city, I can't think of the name of the city, in northern Africa. Where
Carthage.
Carthage, yes, thanks. I knew it started with a C. So Carthage, so he was a Carthaginian. And we looked at his battle that he had with Rome, which was over a long period of time, about 7 years or so. And then when the Romans came in and they destroyed Carthage, they basically just buried the city. I mean, there was nothing left. It was just, and it wasn't discovered till like 2,000 years later that they started digging this up, which actually preserved a lot of the buildings because of how they destroyed it. But the point is, Rome has this trampling down aspect. And you could probably say it happens with a lot of kingdoms, but it refers to the persecution that they do, the type of persecution that they do. But also the other aspect of Rome is the way that if you're enter into an agreement with Rome, they allow you to keep your culture, and they utilize it. And the papacy does that as well. So it stamps down and crushes those that don't agree with it, but it can also deceive you if you go into agreement with it. It will make you think that you get to be free when in reality you are a slave. And then it says, of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them. So this course, of course, this horn here, and this is where we have a problem. When we think about this beast here with the 10 horns, and then we go to Revelation. In Revelation, we're going to have 3 different beasts that have 10 horns. And they're going to be, obviously, the beast of Revelation 13 and 17 and Revelation 12. So you're going to have the great red dragon, you're going to have the composite beast, and then you're going to have this other beast, the one beast with the woman riding upon it, and then one without the woman riding upon it. And you're going to have 10 horns. But the 10 horns do not represent the same thing, because they're representing different periods of time. So this is sort of a bit of a controversial issue, because there's lots of different opinions about it. But you can't just say the 10 horns are the 10 kingdoms of Europe. They symbolize the whole world in some aspect of that, but at different periods of time, they're actually different powers. So when we deal with the 10 horns on his head, and of the other that came up, and before whom 3 fell, we're going to see that these obviously can be dealing and addressing what ends up happening between 508 and 538, so the Aryan nations. But we have to be careful when we start to look at this in Revelation and try to say, well, this is the same thing. So the horns are different. And we also dealt with the 10 toes. So we saw this in the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We also saw this aspect of the 10 toes. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, because that's not the purpose here. But I think there's things that we have to study out and try to understand. And I'm not sure that I understand them fully. I just know that there are differences. And the Millerites understood to some degree the differences. But I would think the average Seventh-day Adventist just thinks they're always the same thing. They're always the same powers in every single one of these beasts that has 10 horns. And I think that would be a mistake. It would just be an assumption. So the differences are important. Now we know then that this little horn would be the papacy, because it's the one that uproots these 3 other horns. And I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. So this judgment was given to the saints of the Most High. In Adventism, there are different views regarding this. So some have the view that judgment was given in favor of the saints of the Most High. Some take it that the saints will now judge. So the judgment was given to the saints of the Most High so that they could be judges. And there's even some other stranger views dealing with that God was actually being judged, and this judgment that was given to the saints of the Most High is really about them judging God. So you'll see these types of ideas that have crept into Adventism. And thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon earth. So he starts to address more the details of this, or interpret it, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. So again, we see this treading down aspect of it. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after him, and he shall be diverse from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now, we know that the end is illustrated in the beginning. So we could apply this, and we have, to what happens at the end of the world. But we still first see its fulfillment when the papacy arose. The papacy also has 3 obstacles at the end of the world. So the beginning illustrates the end. So the beginning of the papacy illustrates the end of the papacy. And that part is not well understood by Seventh-day Adventists. So if I was going to spend more time with it, we could look at that. But that's one thing that you're going to find if you're sharing with people, is to basically get them to examine these differences. That's what I always try to do, is examine the differences between these different beasts and these different times. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until the time and times and the dividing of times. So here we have in Daniel chapter 7 a reference to this period, the 1260 years of papal dominion. And this is called the time, the times, and the dividing of times. And of course, every Seventh-day Adventist, if they had ever been to an evangelistic series in the past, would know that that's a time is 1, that's 2, and that's a half. And that means 3.5 years, or times, which equals 1260 days. Now, we know that this is also referred to in the book of Revelation, and it's called a period of 42 months. And I need to put this on here. Stop sharing. So it's also called a period of 42 months. It's also called 1260 days. And it's also called a time, times and a half, or something like that. So all these 3 show up in the book of Revelation. But we also have, so this period here would be Daniel 7 verse 25. But when we look at this period here, this period of paganism, so I don't think that I have that up here, but anyway, so you take this period of 1260. This is Daniel chapter 12 verse 7. When it talks about that in Daniel 12:7, which we will eventually study. And I heard a man clothed in linen. Well, actually, it has this question in Daniel 12, verse 6. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And then the answer is given here. I'll just share this. And I heard a man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times, and an half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So in this, here, this is dealing with the scattering of the power of the holy people, which occurs under Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and pagan Rome. But it doesn't occur under the papacy. So to try to apply this to this period of 1260 years doesn't really make sense. It would have to be this period. And one of the ways I illustrate then the 2520 in the book of Daniel is show that these are 2 different periods, but they join together to get a 2520. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a break. That's basically, like in a minute, maybe I should just finish off here. I pretty much covered everything about 7, but in connecting this to the book of so Daniel chapter 7. So it says at the end, hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed me, but I kept the matter in my heart. So there's a long period of time in which Daniel thinks about these things. But he's going to have another vision, which we're going to look at, which is Daniel chapter 8. But before we stop, we're going to stop, take a little bit of a break. Is there any comments on Daniel chapter 7, things you think I've missed out? So one is obviously we've connected it to Leviticus 26 through the beasts. There are some other aspects too. We know that it's going to deal with Daniel's captivity because that's what the wild beasts are. But the focus here is not so much at the beginning. The focus is at the end of what these wild beasts symbolize. So the wild beasts in Leviticus 26 only really addresses Babylon, maybe Medo-Persia, that addresses that period of the 220 years. But we do know that the wild beasts go all the way to the end. And so in the book of Daniel, he's starting with Leviticus 26, right? Because he's in captivity. Leviticus 26, at least as far as the second 7 times has already occurred, and he's going to be living through the time of the third 7 times and the fourth 7 times. And of course, he's already experienced that in writing the book because he's writing these things later on. He's not writing them at the time they happened. So obviously he's in the time of Belshazzar when he's writing about the events that happened at the beginning, right? So he's not writing this stuff contemporaneously. He's not writing it down as it happens. Later on, God directs him to write the book of Daniel. And I think probably when he has his visions, I would think maybe that's when he starts to write it, go back, write the stories, and then adds his visions. It's hard to say when he put the whole book together, when he started putting it all together. But we can see that he had the visions, at least when they're dated. The story parts, we don't know when he wrote them, whether he wrote them first and then added the visions later, or whether after he started having his visions that he then added these stories. The point being there that Daniel is not concerned about the start of the 2520 and the different events that happened that led to the captivity, as much as he is concerned with the end result. So his focus is upon the end of the captivity. That's what he's always thinking about. All this, the vision that's given him here, he's trying to apply. How does this apply to the situation that we're in now? And so I think that's an important point. Leviticus 26 is a prophecy that was fulfilled with Daniel as part of that. But then Daniel's focusing upon that God's going to visit them and show his good word towards them and causing them to return to this place. So he's figuring out, or his concern is, when do the 70 years end? When are we going to be restored? When is the temple going to be restored? When is Jerusalem and Judah and God's people restored? And God keeps taking him to look farther into the future than he really wants to look. So again, I asked any thoughts and then I ended up talking. So any thoughts on this?
Well, when you said that Rome wasn't going to scatter, I really believe it will. I mean, after the Sunday law, especially when the Protestants and the spiritualists, whatever the heck they're into, start to pursue God's people who are opposing them, you better believe they're going to be sending armies out to destroy us. So in that sense, we will be scattered again by Rome.
Yes, yeah. I mean, definitely the beginning history is going to be repeated at the end. So that's true. And obviously the time we're living in right now, I mean, it's hard to ignore this pandemic, but especially the restrictions that are being placed upon people by governments. I'm a Canadian, right? So Trudeau is our prime minister, and he was asked a question yesterday are you going to enforce vaccinations? And he sort of sidestepped the question. And I'm not, I'm not a person who likes vaccinations, and I didn't vaccinate my children. I don't think it's the hill I would choose to die on, literally or figuratively. But the fact that governments want to do things, or people are even considering governments forcing the conscience, which is what it is, in all kinds of areas. With something like this pandemic, which is obviously, real, but the overreaction of the authoritarian thinking people definitely is something that gives a person cause for concern of we can easily see how the Sunday law can be brought in and people are just going to accept it. But there's also a lot of censorship that's happening by Facebook and YouTube, which is, censorship is a scary thing, because once you don't have access to information, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. The state can easily overstretch its powers, and nobody can even know that it's happening. And you had another comment?
Sorry, Theodore, I've got a question,
Yeah.
or just an observation, really. So in what's it, 7 verse 9, sort of the end of that, where it says, and the throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels was like burning fire.
Yeah.
Would you think there's any relation to the wheels within the wheels? Because if you think Jesus sitting, on the wheels, and at the moment, all these chiasm seems to put us all on fire, really, in terms of the new light that's coming.
Yeah. Well,
That's just popped in my head when I read that.
Yeah, it is related, because Ezekiel's vision is the vision of God's throne. Now, that's a whole other topic, dealing with Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, because most of us, because of our Western mind, we don't understand actually what it's about. But the Eastern mind sees readily what it's about. What he's seeing is God's universe, which is his throne, and the heads of the living creatures. Those are actually the 4 directions of the compass, and they represent the zodiac, the sky, right? And the wheels within wheels to the Eastern mind would be the sky and the patterns that they see in the heavens. Now, you can't say it's astrology, because astrology, even though it's based upon the sky, is a counterfeit of true astronomy, right?
Amen.
Because astrology means that you think that your destiny is determined by the position of the stars. You don't really have free will. And also, I was studying...
Or when you were born.
Yeah, but, that's modern astrology.
Yeah.
It's more not so much about when you're born. If you look at the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Egyptians and a lot of these pagan cultures, their interest in the sky was that they believed that what they were doing on Earth was actually controlling the sky. So the Aztecs and the Mayans, they did these human sacrifices, and they believed, like, every morning you had to sacrifice a person, because if they didn't, the sun would not rise. So that's much different than saying that God created the heavens and the earth, and he's in control of the eternal destiny, or the destiny of mankind in some way, and that these are symbolized by years and days and months and all these different cycles, and that God uses them to teach us something, because he's given us the sun and the moon for times, for seasons and days and years. But the relationship between nature and God is much different when you're dealing with the Christian understanding of astronomy and how God is a creator, not the secular astronomy, or the spiritualistic astrology, where it's basically a type of pantheism. So we can see that there's this difference. But anyway, I just bring up this about Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, because what you're seeing is the sky is a circular thing, and all these stars and moons and planets and the sun, they move through the heavens in a way that is guided by God. right? And just as God guides the heavens, he also guides our lives personally as we cooperate with him. So to see that God controls the heavens means that also all these events that have occurred in prophetic history that God has foreseen, he has also foreseen my particular case. And he's already pled for me in my case. And he's already arranged circumstances through his providence that I can know him and I can be changed. And so to yield to God is to yield to the God who created everything. And
Amen.
it's a beautiful story in there that's so different from astrology. And that's what you see is the Spirit of God is in the living creatures. God is in control. It's not the sky that's in control. It's not us in control of the sky. It's God that's in control. So we're going to just take a little break here. And then we'll come back and we'll start on Daniel chapter 8, which of course is an extremely, we could do obviously lots of studies on Daniel chapter 8. So we're just going to take a little bit of a break and we'll come back in. I was trying to see the time here. Yeah, come back in 3 minutes. I'll just put this on pause. Dear Father in heaven, we invite your Spirit's presence again as we look at Daniel chapter 8. We know, Lord, that there's much more here than our minds can comprehend. We just ask that your Spirit can teach us the things that are necessary. Be with each person again, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Are you recording, Theodore?
Yeah, I'm recording.
Okay.
Yeah, so turn off your mics unless you're going to ask a question or make a comment. So I'm going to go to the notes that I have here and kind of have skipped them a little bit. So bring these up. Now we've talked about some of these things already, so in some ways it's a review of things because I've sort of jumped ahead. But when you look at Daniel, of course, it is a repeat and enlarge. So obviously you're going to cover some of the same issues. Now I compare Daniel chapter 8 to Leviticus 26, 23 to 26. And that is what we would call the third 7 times. And we know that Daniel is taken captive in 607 in the fall, and then Jehoiachin is taken captive in 597 in the spring. And we had sort of compared roughly before. We compared the first 7 times represents the second, or Daniel chapter 2, the first vision, pride of power. The second, which is wild beasts robbing you of your children, we then compared to the second vision. And then we're going to take this third one here, which is Daniel chapter 8, and we're now going to try to compare it to the third 7 times. So the third 7 times and Daniel chapter 8 go together. Now, this was one that gave me a little bit of trouble when I first saw this, in that the topic that's being talked about here, another way to look at it is that Babylon represents the first 7 times. Media Persia represents the second 7 times. Greece represents the third 7 times. And Rome represents the fourth 7 times. So we sort of have this matrix laid out where you have the 1, 2, 3, and 4, 7 times. And then you can look at the nations as representing those same things. Then you can also take the images themselves and the symbolisms that's in each of those visions or dreams, the 4 lines of prophecy, and you can lay them over top of that as well. So maybe I should draw this. It's not, I do have it in the notes, but I'll try to draw this a little bit more what I mean. Because this is really having part to do with the structure. So you've got the first 7 times, the second, the third, and the fourth. And you then have, obviously, the visions themselves. So this would be Daniel 2. I'll just write the big number here. So Daniel 2. This would be Daniel 7. This would be Daniel 8. And this fourth, I would say it's Daniel 9. But it's also connected to Daniel 12. So maybe a better way to look at it is 9 to 12, even though we could just say that Daniel 10 to 12 is a repeat of all this, but it's mostly Daniel 9. So this is your 7 times. These are these prophecies, and these are the visions. But I could also look at it like this, where you got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Now, another way that I could have even divided this as well, if you took this, you could divide this to pagan and papal if you wanted to. But, there's both of these aspects of these are in here. Now, we could also, of course, see that in each of these visions, obviously all these kingdoms exist. But the question is, what is this ultimately pointing to? And we could always say, well, they're ultimately always pointing to Rome. But it's the certain aspects of these kingdoms that matters. So when we look at Babylon, we can think of Babylon as necessarily, it's about the power, the pride of power. Media-Persia is about the laws. Greece is about, we could just simply call it education. That probably sum up everything. But then when you look at Rome, whether it's pagan or papal, it is, I'd use the word syncretism, except that most people don't know what that means. But basically, it's all of the above. That's probably a better way to look at it. So it characterizes all of the above. And then when we look at each of these particular visions, then we would look at how this vision here relates to the power, the pride of power, how chapter 7 relates to the laws, which we touched on, roughly the laws of the Medes and Persians that cannot be changed, and then this power seeks to change times and laws. And then when we deal with chapter 8, we're going to deal with education. So this is where we are, and we're going to see that it aligns with Greece. Now, this may not make sense to people just when I first show it to them, but as we start to look at the daily and the change from paganism to the abomination that maketh desolate, we can then understand how I choose this word a little bit more readily. So we'll see.
Excuse me, I was going to say that it's Daniel 6 that talks about the inflexible laws, not 7.
Yes, but Daniel 6 and 7 are sister chapters. So Daniel 6, it's paired with Daniel 7. So it's a story. Every one of these visions has stories, or I shouldn't say every one, but most of them have stories paired with it, right? Especially here in this first part, we can see that there's stories paired with the story of Babylon, and then there's stories that are paired with this. If we're going to take Daniel 4 and 5, we could actually parallel it. Daniel 5 would parallel this history. You could probably even say Daniel 4 does. But the point is the stories are paired with this. So this seeks to change times and laws in Daniel 7, and that's a characteristic of Media-Persia, the laws, right? Media-Persia is known for its legal system, where Babylon's known for its warlike power and its control of the nations, where Greece is known for its art and philosophy, right?
Right.
Okay, so yeah, so good comment, good way to clarify that. Okay. So now when we look at this, and again, I kind of always apologize for my old notes. I could update them, but it was a lot of work writing them, and it's hard to update them. But some of the ideas that I wrote at the time, I didn't even really understand what I was saying. They were just little ideas that came into my mind, which later on we were able to see that they did apply. So I said,
Amen.
Daniel chapter 8 has obvious ties to Leviticus in general and Leviticus 26 in particular. So what would be the tie between Daniel chapter 8 and the book of Leviticus in general? What's the book of Leviticus about? And I've said before that the book of Leviticus is the sister book to Daniel, just as the book of Hebrews is the sister book to Revelation in the Old and the New Testaments. So what is it about Leviticus that specifically applies to Daniel chapter 8? If anybody can comment. So Leviticus deals with the sanctuary, and Daniel chapter 8 is addressing the sanctuary. And there are some real interesting points about Daniel chapter 8 that, and I've read all the scholars' works, at least all the old ones, Adventist scholars, in regard to the book of Daniel and the symbolism that's being used, especially on Daniel chapter 8. So the work of Shea and all those scholars within Adventism, who are what we would call conservative scholars that are trying to defend the traditional or church view of the 2300 days and the 70 weeks and so forth. They obviously did not understand the daily, because if you read the scholars' works, they have the daily representing Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, which is wrong. So, they come to that conclusion for a lot of reasons, which we could look at historically, but also theologically. But one is they don't notice some things in Daniel chapter 8 that really, if they had noticed them, they would have come to different conclusions. And so we're going to see some of that. So Daniel chapter 8 is about, and they would agree with this, that it's connected to Leviticus. And I wrote here, it begins with a vision of ram having two horns, one higher than the other, and the higher coming up last, which is Medo-Persia. The ram pushed westward, northward, southward, conquering the nations before him, and became great. This is followed by a male goat coming from the west with great speed and with a notable horn between his eyes, and that's Greece under Alexander the Great. The goat comes to the ram with fury, breaking his two horns. The goat becomes very great, and at that point, the horn is broken and divided into 4 kingdoms of Greece toward the 4 winds under the leadership of Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Next, Daniel sees coming out of one of the 4 winds of heaven a little horn, roam in both its pagan and papal phases, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. So in this vision, and I'm just going to flip over here to the scriptures so this just summed up what you read when you go to Daniel chapter 8. Right, so one is, we saw it was in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, and it says, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. So he's referring to the vision of chapter 7. So it's the same type of vision. It's in that category of vision. It's a symbolic vision. It's a dream. And I saw in vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. So this is an interesting point. When this time here, so quite a while before the fall of Babylon, he is brought in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar to a vision that is in Medo-Persia. So he goes to Shushan, so that's Susa, which is in Persia. And Shushan, the palace, did not exist at the time Daniel had this vision. So he's not just brought to another place, another locality in his vision. He's brought into the future. And the reason that he would be brought into the future is why? What's the reason? Why is he brought to Medo-Persia, even though he's in the time of Babylon? Any thoughts?
Well, I guess it would be because of the bearing on the end time. I mean, all this applies to us.
Okay. Well, here's the way that most people would think of it. They'd say Babylon's falling away, and that's why people think it's near the Belshazzar's going to be dying right away, but he's actually around for another 20 years or so. I think this one is actually 19 years before Babylon falls, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. So, so when people look at this, they just they say, oh, well, Babylon's not important. He's just going to bring them to Medo-Persia. But the simple answer to that would be he's being brought to the future because he's going to be brought to the start of the 2300 days. That's the history that he's looking at, or the point at which he's going to start this period of time that's being talked about under 2,300 days. That's in the time of the kingdom of Persia. So he's not going to be in the time of Babylon. He's going to be brought forward to the future. Now, exactly which year he's brought to doesn't really say, but he's brought to someplace in the future when Persia is now ruling, not Babylon, because it's under Persia that the 2300 days begins. This is really an important point, and often, well, I would say it's always missed out, but every commentator, Adventist commentator, they just don't see it. They just think he's just in vision, and Shushan's the palaces, but he's not even in Persia. He's in Babylon still. Medo-Persia has not conquered Babylon yet, but yet he's brought to this place in the future where that exists after Babylon has fallen. So I think it's an interesting point. So, and he just talks about it, which is in the province of Elam. One of the indications is that he may have written this vision much later, because to refer to Shushan the palace, he might not have known at the time when he wrote the vision where he was until Medo-Persia conquered Rome, and he ends up in Shushan the palace, and then he could look back at this vision he had in chapter 8 and recognize that's where I was. Or he could have written down the vision and then added more detail to it later, maybe added this title, this is where I was, but not knowing that necessarily when he had the vision. So, because it's in the province of Elam, I was by the river of Ulai, and then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, right? So we talked about that in my description of this. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw a ram pushing westward, northward, southward. So if it's pushing westward, northward, and southward, where is it coming from? This is kind of
East.
it's coming from the east, right? So this is obviously, this is Persia. Persia's in the east. It's coming from the east. And then you're going to have, and then it says, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now, my wife and I have been watching documentaries on history. And so we watched a documentary. I don't know if she watched this one with me, but I watched a documentary on the rise of it was mostly on King Darius. Not Darius the Mede, but Darius the Persian, and just about the heights in which Persia came and how it consolidated through their legal system this huge empire. It was very, very interesting. It gave a lot of background information in understanding this. We were looking at, my wife did watch it with me, because it was Persepolis. It was a documentary on the city of Persepolis. Now, Persepolis is Greek, which means the city of Persia. Persia is Persia. And that city was it's still, in a sense, well preserved. I mean, for a city in the middle of the desert, it's just basically the forgotten city. It's a very interesting documentary. But just Persia is sort of a forgotten kingdom, in modern minds. Most people, because we're a continuation of Rome and Greece, right? Rome is really what we're about. But Persia provided this legal system, which Rome then utilized. So Rome is also about law, and our country, our modern nations have a lot to do with laws. Laws are extremely important. Anyway, so Persia developed this great empire, and it says here in 8 verse 4, and became great. That word great is gadol. It's a Hebrew word which means to exalt something, right? So it becomes exalted. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So we know, of course, this is Alexander, and this is Greece coming from the west against this ram that's been coming from the east. And they're going to collide, and then we know that Persia is going to fall, and Greece is going to rise. And actually, that's what this documentary was about. It was about how Alexander destroyed Persia when he conquered it. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler or anger against him, and smote the ram and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Now, the part that I bring out usually here has to do with the fact that the goat waxed very great. So we have Gadol mentioned in verse 4. And then when you look here, I'm just going to have to look at my Hebrew here in verse 8. Yeah, so I'm just trying to see the word that modifies it. So we have here, there's Gadol, and I looked at this before, I can't remember what the word was. Yeah, so this is, when you go back to King James so you guys can see it. So the goat waxed very great. Now there's a bunch of different words here. There's Gadol, there's ad, which means until. So he's reaching to a higher point. So that's why they say he waxed very great. And then it's this word miot, and it's a superlative or an intensive form of the word, and it means lots of different things, but it also refers to quickly or to much. So when it says he waxed very great, it's obviously, they have that word gadol, which is exalted, but it happened rapidly, and of course we know this would be true of Alexander the Great. He conquered this empire in a very short period of time. So Medo-Persia conquered, it's really the first worldwide empire, if you want to call it that, even bigger than Babylon. But it conquered it over a much slower period of time, but mostly under Darius the Great is when it really expanded. But then, you have it slowly waned away. But then when Alexander came, he conquered a much larger territory in a much quicker period of time. But it's also this word gadol has to do with this exaltation. And really it's a type of self-exaltation that's being talked about. We're going to see how we, as we progress in this story, how that applies. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. So here you have now one waxing great and one waxing exceeding great. Now, the word that's modifying the word gadol is the word yether. It means an excess, superiority. And it means lots of other things. It's translated different things at other time as well. But it's something that overflows, flows, or overhangs. So the idea here is this little horn is going to be even more self-exaltation than Medo-Persia or Greece. So it's a waxing exceeding great. Now, we have a number of other things that aren't noticed really by scholars. Now, they will notice that the goat and the ram are sanctuary animals. They're animals that are offered in the sanctuary. And they will focus upon this, that there's this sanctuary symbolism that is utilized in Daniel chapter 8. What they fail to recognize is that there's a problem. And the problem is that, my phone's ringing. The problem is that they are not fit for sacrifice in the sanctuary. So when you look at a sanctuary animal, like a ram or a goat, they have to be without blemish. And we can see that that's a problem. With the ram, it has two horns, one's larger than the other. It's not fit for sacrifice. It also is going to have, the horns are going to be broken. Again, an animal with a broken horn would not be fit for sacrifice. And then even the goat. So when we look at the goat, it's going to break into into four horns, and also one of these other horns is going to grow up. So these are deformed creatures. They cannot be offered in the sanctuary. And so we can see that then this is an impure sanctuary. It's not God's sanctuary that's being addressed by the ram and the goat. So even though they're sanctuary animals, they use this as an idea that this is referring to Christ's heavenly sanctuary when you deal with this, the daily. And they try to utilize the earthly sanctuary as a type of the heavenly sanctuary. And in the earthly sanctuary, you have animals that are offered, goats and rams. But we can see that if these are corrupted animals, they can't possibly be representing true worship. So I think that's an important point. So there's these points that are often missed out, and they really affect how we're going to understand this. So now we have the little horn, and of course, modern scholarship, Adventist scholarship, would recognize, at least if they're conservative scholarship, that the little horn represents Rome, both pagan and papal. But what ends up happening here is a very interesting description of this. So if you look at the Hebrew, which you can kind of see in the King James, is that sometimes it's referred to in the feminine form and sometimes in the masculine form. So when it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and towards the pleasant land. So this one, if it's going towards the south and towards the east, and then towards Jerusalem, this power must be in the direction that we would see Rome. So it wouldn't be, it obviously couldn't be Antiochus Epiphanes or anything like that. That would be the wrong direction. So then, because Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't wax towards the south and the east in the pleasant land, he's going to be actually in the east, where Ptolemy's in the south. So just wouldn't fit the geography of it. And then it says, it waxed great. When it says it wax great. That's in the feminine form. So the feminine form of the word, of a noun, is, you can't see it here in English. So the word it, in a sense, is kind of an added word, but it exists within the verb or the noun that's being used. So it waxed great. So it's actually in the verb here, saying that it's a feminine thing that waxes, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. And then it says, yea, he magnified himself, even to the prince of the host. So now we have a masculine form. So the it and the he cannot be the same power. So if we look at it as being pagan and papal, papal would be the it, the he would be, did I do that right? I did it backwards. Papal would be the it, pagan would be the he. So who magnified himself against the prince of the host? That would be pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is the one that magnified itself against Christ. It crucified him. And then it says, by him, the daily sacrifice was taken away. So there is a book by a guy named Heidi Hikes. Heidi Hikes is, my understanding is he's a German Adventist who ended up taking over Hope International in Washington State at some point. And he wrote a series of books called source books. He has the 1798 source book, the 538 source book, the 508 source book, the 1844 source book, where he gives a lot of these documentations for the events that happened in these years. And he attacks the view, the traditional view of the daily that was understood by the pioneers, and tries to give support for the modern view of the daily, which came from Satan, that it's Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. And he's a very deceptive writer. He does a lot of bait and switch. And when people do that, I'm always leery of them. So, and he also, when he attacks the view, he always picks and chooses which parts of the view of the pioneers had, which he would like to attack. He doesn't actually look at what we believe now. And then he argues that, saying, well, we've got all these new modifications. It's not even similar to the pioneers' view. But yet he doesn't really address our view at all. So there's a reason why our views grow and change, because we have greater understanding. But you can't say it's not similar to the pioneer view. There's some arguments that we make, some details in the arguments that we make now that are different than Miller would have made. But really, it's essentially the same view. The daily represents paganism, and the abomination of desolation is papalism. So there's the two phases of pagan and papal Rome, which they would agree with, but yet when we come to the daily, they don't look at it as paganism at all. They look at it as Christ's high priestly ministry. And I remember trying to understand this years and years ago when I was in university, and I wrote a paper on the book of Daniel. And when I got to Daniel chapter 8, I had a real problem because I couldn't support the view that I had been taught. I had never been taught the pioneer view of the daily, and so I was trying to support the new view, but I ran into a problem. I couldn't support the 2300 days with the new view. Of course, I kind of it was a paper for university, so I just kind of washed it over a little bit. Didn't really address the problems that I was facing. But it wasn't until I understood the pioneer view that I could see where the problems were that I had. So one of the things that we will see is we'll see this feminine, masculine switching back and forth. He magnified himself against the prince of the host. Now, and then it says, and by him. So part of the problem here is this word by means from. Now, if you read the Great Controversy, the chapter dealing with 2 Thessalonians, it's the second or third chapter in the Great Controversy. I think it's chapter 2, where she talks about the change from paganism to papalism. Ellen White is describing the pioneer view, the pioneer understanding of the daily, without addressing the daily directly. She does it by addressing 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And Adventism, a number of years ago, basically, I think it would have been 2012, I went to a Bible study of a guy who's in this message. And we go to his Bible study. We didn't really know how much he was studying this stuff. We knew that he let us talk about the 25:20 and stuff. But the Sabbath School Quarterly was on 2 Thessalonians, and this would have been in the fall of 2012. And he was a quiet guy, never talked really very much. But he had been to church that Sabbath and was teaching the quarterly. He was a Sabbath school teacher. And he understood the pioneer view of the daily. And the church had all rebelled against the pioneer view, that the church that he went to. And I mean, he was so animated in that study, that Saturday night study at his house that we had every week. It's the first time I'd ever seen him animated. And he just went through and explained what was wrong, with what was being taught, and how, he was sort of shut down at church. But anyway, the real issue in that 2 Thessalonians is that they took the position, the Sabbath School Quarterly took the position that the power that hindered was Christ, and it had to be taken out of the way. And every single commentary I've ever seen, any traditional commentary, Adventist commentaries, they all recognize that what had to be taken out of the way was pagan Rome for the man of sin to be revealed. So they had now done this revisionism of Adventism because they understood the logic that if you have the daily representing Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel 11 and 12, where it's mentioned as well, then you can't have 2 Thessalonians being Rome. It has to also be Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. And so this was a very profound insight that he had in attacking this, which, when we understand the reason that William Miller understood the daily was Rome, was his reading of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. That for the man of sin had to be taken, for the man of sin to be revealed, that was hindering the papacy had to be removed. So hopefully that's clear. Maybe I should look at that verse. So let's just go there, because there may be some people unfamiliar with it. So he's talking to the Thessalonians and saying, Jesus isn't going to come back yet because something has to happen. He says, let no man deceive you. Let no man deceive you by any means. For that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Then he says in verse 6, and now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. Now that word withholdeth is the same word that's translated as letteth and let in verse 7. For the mystery of all iniquity doth already work. Only he who now withholdeth will continue to hold, or will let, until he be taken out of the way. And if you read old commentaries, even some relatively new ones, they will all clearly tell you that that is pagan Rome, is the one that was restraining papal Rome, because they were persecuting Christians. So they had to be taken out of the way, not Christ's ministry. And the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now withholdeth will continue to do so, withhold, until he be taken out of the way. Then shall the wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, etc. So we know this is talking about the papacy, because that's who is going to be attacked at the end of the world. So this is an important point in understanding the daily, to understand its connection to 2 Thessalonians, that that Miller had, but also to see how the church recognizes that connection and has done an injustice to God's word by rewriting our understanding of prophecy. So when it says in verse 11, and he magnified himself, so this would be Rome. I was mentioning Heidi Hikes. Now he will talk about where is it here? Yeah, and this word, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So if you just read it the way, and our different scholars sort of present it differently, but basically many of them will recognize that this is Rome, a pagan that magnifies himself. But then it says, by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Would be a problem. But the way that they will often do this is they will say, it's from him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Now, if you read in Ellen White, she's clear that it's papacy takes the daily from paganism and it incorporates it into Christianity. So when it says he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, this is talking about Rome. But when it says by him, Heidi Hikes even points out that this is from him. And so what happens is that the papacy comes and takes from him, Rome, the one who magnifies himself against the prince of the host, and not from him, the prince of the host. You see the difference? So the way Heidi Hikes would do it, and a lot of our modern scholars would do it, is that he magnifies himself against Christ, but it's going to be taken by the papacy from Christ. The daily sacrifice is going to be taken away from Christ. Somebody's making a comment here. It's Angela, and I want to see what she says. It looks interesting. She says, as a very new SDA, I recall being taught that 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 6 referred to the Holy Spirit being taken away, withdrawn from the earth, and then the resurgence of the papal supremacy. Wow. So we can see that this idea has come in quite a long time where they started attacking 2 Thessalonians. The view that it's Rome that needs to be taken out of the way. So here again, we look at this verse 11, Daniel 8:11 is sort of the key. Yea, he, which is pagan Rome, magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and from pagan Rome, this it doesn't say it there, but it is the papacy. It's going to, and from him, the daily sacrifice was taken away, and it's taken away partly by the papacy, but also by France. So, France is really the one that does the taking away of pagan Rome and other powers as well. But basically, these Germanic tribes that come in, and it's France that sits the papacy upon the throne of the earth. So it doesn't really say, from him, the papacy does this, but the papacy does take the daily, and the daily is paganism, but it's going to transform it. And then it says, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now the word place here, there's two words that are translated place. Kom and kom. And these words sound very, very similar, and they're not spelled the same in Hebrew. One is kof, yod, mem, and the other one is kaf, yod, not yod, but vav, not yod, vav, and nun. So one's kom, and the other one's kom. And I can't remember which one's which, so I just have to always get those two mixed up. It's too similar. So if I look on this word place, the place of his sanctuary, this is actually makom. So this is the one that has a kaf. So the ma is just, it's a modifying consonant. The place of his sanctuary. Now, the place here, and the other one, kom, which has an M and a kaf, or a kof at the beginning. So it's like a Q sound. It's hard to explain. Looks different than a kaf. So they're different shape and a slightly different sound. We refer to actually, when it talks about in the Bible, the place of his sanctuary, God's sanctuary, it uses this other word. Now, we are also familiar with these two words because we should know Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin. And it's the last part of their names. Jehoiakim, is this word place that refers to the sacred place of the sanctuary, where Chin, his name also means place at the end, but it's this one here that you see dealing with a pagan sanctuary, a place of a pagan sanctuary. So the point is, I know it's a little bit of Hebrew and not explained well, but when it says the place of his sanctuary was cast down, this is referring to a pagan place. Now, we also have this other word, which is translated cast down. Now, Miller never understood this properly because he didn't know the Hebrew and Greek. And it is kind of hard to explain. Well, let's leave it this way. So what we see happening is the papacy takes over pagan Rome, and it takes over the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon is the place, the sanctuary that's in Rome, with all. It's not the Parthenon. Yes, the Pantheon. I always get those two mixed up too. So the Pantheon is the one that's Rome. The Parthenon is the one in Nashville. So the Pantheon, and the Pantheon is where they had all these different gods. And this is the place of Rome's sanctuary. Now, of course, the pagan part of it was cast down, but the papacy set up itself in that place. It was given its power, seat, and great authority. And so this is what this is referring to. So this is referring to that. Now it says, and an host was given him. So this host is an army, was given him against the daily. Now, can we believe that there's an army that goes against Christ's heavenly sanctuary? They have a counterfeit, but they cannot oppose Christ in heaven. Christ's sanctuary is in heaven. This daily is paganism. And so the army that was given, the host that was given against paganism, was the army of France. Now, some people might have some different views on this, so if you do, that's fine if you share them, but this is how I understand it. And by reason of transgression, and it cast down, and this is the word I was actually looking for, not the other one. This is the word, it cast down the truth to the ground and practiced and prospered. There's another word. I forget which word that I'm looking for. I haven't practiced this one in a while. I haven't done this one. The word, where is it? That was the word, taken away. That's the word I'm looking for. So if you go back to chapter 8, verse 11, we have this word room. And this word here, if you look in Daniel 8:11, the way that he took this word, the way that Miller took this word, is that the daily was taken away. And so we think of that as removed. And it can be in the word removed, but it can mean different things depending on the context. And this is one of those words that the church, the scholars use to try to argue that this is, that Satan takes away, or papacy takes away Christ's heavenly ministry. But let's look at this word in some other places. So if you go to Daniel 11, verse 31, or not this word, but this sort of word that people just on the surface in the King James, don't notice that there's a difference. Now we know that Miller said it had to be taken out of the way, and he used 2 Thessalonians. But in Daniel 11, verse 31, it says, "And the arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So here we have this word to take away. But you can see it's a different word. It's not the word room, it's the word sir. Now, so they're words that are related, well, not related etymologically, but related in sort of how we see them. So the word sir means to pluck or to pull away, to revolt. It has all kinds of different meanings. But the primitive word means to turn off literally or figuratively. So it can be used to behead something, to bring, to call back, decline, depart, shoot. So all these different ideas. But if we look at the word room, the word means to lift up. And of course, if I lift something up, I'm taking it away. And it's used in the sanctuary when you do the heave offering, when you lift up an offering. So obviously you have to take it away from something, but it's not really about taking away. It's about exalting or lifting something up. So, and you see this also in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, when it talks about the daily being taken out of the way. So the point is, when we go to this passage here and you want to understand Daniel chapter 11, or Daniel chapter 8, verse 11, when it says, "Yea, he, pagan Rome, magnified himself even against the prince of the host, and even against the prince of the host, and from him the daily sacrifice was taken away." It's not that it's taken away. The daily sacrifice was lifted up and exalted. And that's what the papacy did. If you read Ellen White's in the Great Controversy, where she talks about this change from pagan to papal, she shows that paganism is embodied in the papacy, that it basically took paganism's principles and lifted them up in the papacy. So that's what's being talked about there. So he's going to lift up the daily. So he's not getting rid of the daily in this verse. He's lifting up the daily. And the place of his sanctuary being cast down is reference to the pantheon, but it's also representing to the city of Rome, as far as the pagan Rome. It gets replaced by the papacy. So the papacy takes it over, is the whole idea of that verse. So when a host was given him against the daily, which is referring to France, by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered, this is the transgression of desolation, which was typified by pagan Rome when it surrounded Jerusalem with its armies, but it's specifically here referring to the papacy. And then it says in verse 13, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot?" So we're going to spend, because we're almost out of time, we're going to spend part of our next class a week from now to sort of finish off Daniel chapter 8 as we go into Daniel chapter 9. So we obviously didn't get finished with Daniel 8. So some of the things that are here are important. So there's this question that's being asked. And if you see that the daily being taken away is Christ's ministry being taken away by Rome, whether you think it's pagan Rome or papal Rome, the earliest you can have it being taken away would be at the time that Christ actually sets up his ministry. You couldn't go back and have his heavenly ministry being taken away prior to his heavenly ministry. And that's a real problem that I ran into when I was studying this, when I was like 31 years old at the time, and really trying to understand Daniel chapter 8. Because when you write a paper, you then have to explain yourself. And I couldn't explain how we could have the 2300 days begin with the taking away of Christ's ministry, because that's what it's talking about here. It says, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice? So we have the daily sacrifice, which is Christ's heavenly ministry, if that's what you believe, and the transgression of desolation, the papacy, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. And the answer is unto 2,300 days. So it doesn't make any sense, because the 2,300 days is going to start long before that, in 457 BC. Christ doesn't have a daily ministry to be taken out of the way. So the daily here cannot possibly refer to something that began or that is connected with Christ's heavenly sanctuary. It has to continue for this long period. Now, they do some arguments, and I remember some of them was, well, it's just, it's going to go unto 2,300 days up from a certain point, but it doesn't mean that that's where it starts. And so I just noticed my picture froze there for a second, so hopefully that's okay. Everybody's still there. So this idea then of the 2,300 days is we're going to get into that a little bit more. And there are some people who are going to be watching these videos who aren't as familiar as the ones who are participating here today. But we need to understand this point, that if you're going to be explaining this to Seventh-day Adventists, they're going to need to understand the correct view of the daily. And it's going to be one of the points that for some people, that can be a point that wins them over on two accounts. There are people who actually believe the pioneer view of the daily and the 2520 and all these other truths that we get from Leviticus 26 will fit in with that view of the daily. Now, if they have the new view of the daily, it won't fit. But they can also see that Adventism was dependent upon this idea of the two desolating powers, paganism and papalism. So it is a very important point in our message to understanding the view of the daily. So that's, we're going to look at this next week and try to tie that up. And then we're going to go into Daniel chapter 9, which I don't think we're going to get through in a whole lesson, but hopefully we can. So let's close with prayer, unless there's some particular question regarding what we've talked about that somebody would like to comment on. Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the time that we could spend together. We know that we don't understand everything here, but there's many things that you've made clear. Help us to continue to study, to be diligent students of your word, and give us wisdom and discernment as we study your word. Also give us skills in sharing truths with others. Help us to reveal your character and how we treat others, to talk kindly to people, not to put them down, to argue, but to show a Christ-like character and to win them over through the way that they are being treated by us. Help us also, Lord, to develop that character. And we thank you for all the things that you're doing. We pray for this message and the things that we're studying, and help us to share them, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm going to stop the recording here.